Once upon a time, in an African town named Jima, there lived a young girl named Sifa. Sifa was as sharp as a needle. Though she was just 11 years old, her mind was quick, her hands were busy, and her smile was like the first rain after a long dry season. Everyone in the town said, "This girl is no ordinary child." Her father, Kofi, loved her more than words could say. "My princess," he often called her, pride filling his voice like a drum beat. Sifa was the star of her school, always coming home with marks that made her father's chest swell. "You will be great, my daughter," Kofi would say, patting her head. He often reminded her to always help the elderly neighbors in their small, lively community, which Sifa did with enthusiasm. When Sifa turned 15, Kofi knew she was ready for more. He enrolled her in secondary school, even though she was younger than the others. "You will learn and soar higher than the birds," he told her. But Kofi was a trader, always traveling to faraway lands, buying and selling goods. Before leaving, he would often bring Sifa small gifts, a colorful scarf or a storybook, to remind her that she was always on his mind. He could not stay long at home, so Kofi hired a lesson teacher, Mr. Dario. "Teach my daughter well," he said, handing him the task. Mr. Dario came often, his face streaked like the Harmattan wind. At first, he seemed like a good teacher, helping Sifa with her books. But while Kofi was away, things were not perfect at home. Sifa's mother, Amani, was as beautiful as a peacock, but her heart seemed far from her home. Amani loved to dress in fine clothes, paint her face like the rising sun, and dance the nights away at parties. She left the house early, her perfume trailing behind her like a whisper, and returned only when the moon was tired of shining. Sifa longed for her mother's care, her warmth, even just a moment to talk. But Amani never stayed still long enough to notice her. Laughter and chatter were always reserved for the parties she loved, leaving her daughter behind in a house that felt too big and too quiet. The evenings, when Amani was absent, were filled with the chirping of crickets and the faint hum of distant music. One night, Sifa sat in the small living room, her heart heavy with a secret she had to share. She heard the ticking of the clock, each sound like a hammer on her chest. She had prepared herself, whispering, "Tonight I'll tell her. She'll listen this time." As the hours passed and the shadows grew longer, Sifa's eyes began to close. But she had to stay awake. She filled a small basin with icy water and dipped her feet inside, the chill biting her skin. It was her way of fighting sleep, of holding on to hope. She glanced at the family photo on the wall, the smiles of her parents and herself now a distant memory. But the night turned into morning, and Amani still hadn't come home. Sifa's heart sank, heavy as a stone dropped into a deep well. When the first rays of sunlight kissed the earth, Sifa rose quickly. She went straight to her mother's room, determined to speak. But the bed was empty, the covers untouched. Amani was gone again. Tears welled in Sifa's eyes, but she blinked them away. Maybe next time, she told herself, her voice trembling. And so the day began, with Sifa carrying the weight of her untold words, like a bird forced to fly with broken wings. One warm afternoon, the air in Jima town felt heavy, as if it carried a secret no one wanted to tell. Mr. Dario arrived at Sifa's house for her usual lesson, his face strict as always. He carried his books, but behind his glasses, his eyes carried something darker. The house was still, with no sound but the scratch of chalk on paper and the occasional creak of a chair. Mr. Dario sat across from Sifa, watching her as she solved the problems he had given. After a while, he asked casually, "Is your mother home?" Sifa, without looking up, shook her head. "No, sir." She went out. Mr. Dario smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was like the grin of a hyena stalking its prey. "Let's take a break," he said, standing up. Sifa followed him into the kitchen, thinking he wanted to eat. But as she reached for a bowl, she heard the soft click of the door locking. Her heart jumped, and she turned to see Mr. Dario standing close behind her. "Mr. D," she began, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" Instead of answering, he reached out and grabbed her arm. His hands were rough, and his touch made her skin crawl. "Don't scream," he whispered, his voice sharp like a knife. "If you tell anyone, I'll make sure you fail all your exams. They'll send you away from school." And just like that, he forcefully slept with her without anyone knowing. Tears spilled from Sifa's eyes, but her voice stayed trapped in her throat. Mr. Dario touched her where he shouldn't, his hands like the claws of a monster. She felt frozen, like a small bird caught in a hawk's grip. When he was done, he stepped back, straightened his shirt, and said, "Go and get me some food." His voice was calm, as if nothing had happened. Sifa's hands shook as she served him. When he finished eating, he stood and said, "Remember, not a word to anyone." Then he left, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. The sound of the door closing echoed in the empty house, amplifying her pain. That night, Manny came home earlier than usual, her face tired, but Sifa didn't care. She ran to her mother's room, her heart pounding like a drum. "Mama, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "What is it?" Sifa Amani asked, her voice sharp and impatient. "It's about the lesson teacher." Before Sifa could finish, Amani cut her off. "Don't start making excuses. You just don't want to study. Do you always looking for a way to be lazy?" "But, Mama, I said enough," Amani snapped, brushing her daughter aside as she went to her room. Sifa stood there, her words swallowed by her mother's anger. She felt smaller than ever, like a bird trapped in a cage with no one to hear its song. That night, she cried herself to sleep, her pillow wet with tears and her heart heavy with silence. Sifa's world became dark, like a stormy sky with no sunlight. She carried a heavy burden, one too big for her small shoulders. At school, her once bright mind became clouded. She stared blankly at the blackboard, unable to focus. Her teachers called her name, but she barely heard them. At night, she cried silently, her pillow soaked with tears. Her body grew thinner, her laughter disappeared, and her eyes, once sparkling, were now dull. The joy that used to fill her heart was gone, replaced by fear and sadness. Mr. Dario, the lesson teacher, continued to visit. Each time his presence felt like a dark shadow creeping into the house. He would smile his fake smile, act as if nothing was wrong, and then wait for the moment they were alone. "Mama doesn't believe me," she thought, her chest tight with sorrow. "I wish Papa would come home." She dreamed of her father's warm hugs and the way he called her my princess. She hoped, prayed, and waited, but the days dragged on, and Koki was still away. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, as Kofi returned from his long journey. His steps were tired, but his heart was full of joy to see his family again. As he approached the house, he heard noises coming from inside, screams, faint but filled with fear. Kofi froze for a moment. Amani, he called, thinking his wife might be in trouble. He dropped his bags and rushed toward the door. Bursting into the house, he stopped in his tracks. What he saw made his blood boil. Mr. Dario, the lesson teacher, was on top of his daughter Sifa, forcing himself on her. Her face was wet with tears, her hands pushing weakly against him. Sifa, Kofi roared, his voice shaking the walls. Mr. Dario turned, his face pale as if he had seen a ghost. He scrambled to his feet, panicked like a cornered rat. Seeing Kofi's rage, he dashed toward the window, desperate to escape. "Stop him!" Kofi shouted. But before anyone could move, Mr. Dario leapt through the window. The night air was filled with the sickening sound of his body hitting the ground hard, followed by a loud cry of pain. Kofi ran outside and found Mr. Dario, spread on the ground, his leg twisted at an odd angle. He was writhing in pain, unable to move. Kofi grabbed him by the collar, lifting him like a sack of grain. "You dare touch my daughter," Kofi growled, his voice low and dangerous. His face clenched as he shook the man. The morning sunlight streamed through the doorway, casting long shadows across the room. Kofi's fingers tightened on the man's collar, his knuckles white with fury. "Please forgive me," Mr. Dario whimpered, his voice trembling. I thought no one would know. There's never anyone at home. I took advantage." His words hit Kofi like a slap. The weight of his absence, of leaving Sifa unprotected, crashing over him like a tidal wave. A small bird chirped outside the window, its innocent song contrasting painfully with the storm raging inside Kofi's heart. Tears filled Kofi's eyes, but his anger did not waver. He dragged Mr. Dario back into the house, his mind set on one thing: making the man pay for what he had done. Inside, Sifa sat trembling in a corner, her small frame shaking with sobs. The faint aroma of last night's stew still lingered in the air, but it felt misplaced in the heavy silence of the room. "It's over, my daughter," Kofi said, his voice softer now as he knelt beside her. "I am here. No one will hurt you again." But the fire of his rage was not yet extinguished. He looked at Mr. Dario, still groaning in pain, and knew the man's punishment had only just begun. Kofi's fury burned hotter than the midday sun as he dragged Mr. Dario through the dusty streets of Jima town. The man's broken leg dragged limply behind him, leaving a faint trail in the dirt road. He whimpered in pain, but Kofi's grip never loosened. People peeked out of their homes, their eyes widening at the sight. "What's happening?" someone whispered from behind a cracked door. "Is that the lesson teacher?" Another gasped from a shaded veranda. "What has he done?" Kofi said nothing, his face set like stone, but his eyes told the story, a story of betrayal, anger, and sorrow. By the time he reached the king's palace, a crowd had formed behind him, murmuring in shock and disbelief. The palace guards, tall and fierce, stood at the gates. "What is this?" Kofi, one of them, asked, stepping forward, his spear gleaming in the sunlight. "This man," Kofi growled, tossing Mr. Dario at their feet, "dared to harm my daughter. He forced himself on her in my own home." The crowd erupted in outrage. Shouts of "monster" and "shame on him" filled the air. The guards didn't wait for more explanation. They grabbed Mr. Dario and dragged him inside the palace. The king, a wise and just ruler, listened carefully as Kofi told him everything: Sifa's tears, Mr. Dario's confession, and the burden of being a father who had trusted the wrong man. All of it spilled out like water from a broken pot. The king's face darkened with anger. Such evil cannot go unpunished, he declared. Guards, make sure this man pays for his wickedness. The guards wasted no time. They beat Mr. Dario with sticks and threw him into the deepest, darkest cell in the palace prison. The iron door clanged shut with a finality that echoed through the stone corridors. The news spread quickly through the town, and by nightfall, everyone knew what had happened. People came to Kofi's house in droves, bringing food and gifts, their voices full of sympathy. "You are a good man, Kofi," they said, their hands resting on his shoulder. "We are here for Sifa. She is like a daughter to us all." Their support wrapped around Sifa like a warm blanket, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw a glimmer of hope. But Kofi's anger was not yet spent. He turned his thoughts to Amani, the mother who had failed to protect her daughter. With fire in his eyes, he prepared to confront her, determined to hold her accountable for the role she had played in their pain. When Kofi returned home with Sifa, he found Amani standing before a mirror, painting her face with bright colors. The vibrant strokes of red and gold stood out starkly against her pale skin. She hummed to herself, completely unaware of the storm brewing in her own home. A pile of fine clothes lay on the bed, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the muted sadness in the air. Amani Kofi's voice thundered through the house. Startled, Amani turned, a brush still in her hand. "Why are you shouting, Kofi? I'm getting ready to go out." "Go out," Kofi's face darkened with rage. "While your daughter suffers, while your house burns from your neglect, look at her." He pointed to Sifa, who stood quietly in the corner, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. "What's the matter with her?" Amani asked, waving dismissively. "Children cry all the time." Kofi's patience snapped like a dry twig. He grabbed Amani's clothes and threw them across the room. The rustle of fabric hitting the floor sounded like thunder in the charged atmosphere. He knocked over her jewelry box, sending necklaces and earrings scattering to the floor like fallen stars. "You are no mother," Kofi roared. "You left your child alone, and a monster came into our home because of you. You let her cry for help, and you never listened. You failed her. Amani, you failed us all. Amani, you failed her." Amani stood frozen, her face pale. "What are you talking about, Kofi?" she stammered. But Kofi did not stop. He stormed out of the house, dragging Amani behind him. The townspeople, already gathered to support Sifa, looked on as Kofi exposed Amani's neglect for all to hear. "She left my daughter alone for parties. She never cared to know what was happening under her own roof," Kofi shouted. The crowd erupted in anger. "Shame on her," they cried. "What kind of mother abandons her child?" Women shook their heads in disbelief. Men muttered curses under their breath. Children whispered, "That's Sifa's mother." Objects began to fly: rotten fruit, stones, anything the townspeople could find. Amani shielded her face, her heart sinking with every insult hurled her way. "Kofi, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "Sorry," Kofi interrupted. "It's too late for sorry. Leave this town. You are no wife of mine, and you are no wife of mine, and you are no mother to Sifa. Amani tried to protest, but the crowd's anger drowned her words. They pushed her out of the town, their shouts chasing her into the distance. That night, Amani sat alone under the open sky, tears falling like rain. She realized too late what she had lost: her home, her family, and the love of her daughter. With Amani gone, the house felt quieter but warmer. The scent of freshly brewed tea wafted through the air as Kofi sat with Sifa, holding her close as if to shield her from the world. "My princess," he said softly, "I'm here now. No one will hurt you again." Sifa looked up at her father, her tears drying for the first time in days. In his arms she felt safe, like a bird finally finding its nest. Kofi promised to protect her, to never leave her side again. "We will rebuild together," he said, his voice steady. Sifa began to heal, her laughter once lost, slowly returning like the first drops of rain after a long drought. She went back to school, her confidence growing with each passing day. Her teachers noticed the change. "Sifa is back," they whispered with smiles. The townspeople continued to support her, treating her like their own daughter. Gifts of food, clothes, and books filled the house. "You are not alone," they told her. Sifa's bond with her father grew stronger. She worked hard in her studies, determined to make him proud. Kofi, in turn, became her greatest cheerleader, always reminding her of her strength and worth. In time, the scars of the past faded. Sifa's future shone bright again, like the rising sun over Jima town. She knew her father was her hero, her protector, and her greatest source of hope. Together, they rebuilt their life, leaving the shadows of pain behind them. This story reminds us of the power of resilience, love, and justice in the face of adversity. Kofi's unwavering commitment to protecting Sifa and rebuilding their lives demonstrates the strength of family bonds. It also serves as a reminder that silence should never protect wrongdoing and that communities thrive when they unite to stand against injustice. Together, we can build a world where every voice is heard, every child is safe, and every family is whole. Let us strive to inspire courage, compassion, and change in our own lives and those around us. Once upon a time, in a small town where the sun rose bright and the rivers flowed sweet, there lived a man named Emmanuel, but popularly called Mr. Manny by a lot of people. Mr. Manny was poor, so poor that his pockets were as empty as a dried up well. While other men wore fine clothes and spoke big words, Mr. Manny had no fancy words to share. You see, Mr. Manny couldn't read or write. He was the only man in the village who had never gone to school, and because of this, everyone looked down on him. Mr. Manny had a big family, a family so big it was like a field filled with flowers. He had 3 wives, each one more stubborn than the last, and 10 daughters as beautiful as moonlight. Despite the laughter and chaos that came from such a large family, Mr. Manny often found himself sitting alone by the riverside, staring into the water, wondering if his life would ever change. But even with his large family, Mr. Manny was alone. The villagers laughed at him whenever he walked by. "Look at Mr. Manny," they'd say, shaking their heads. "The man doesn't even know his letters. How foolish he must feel." Mr. Manny never answered back. He just kept his head down, his heart heavy like a stone at the bottom of the river. And as he walked, he could feel their laughter chasing him like shadows in the sun. But what no one in the village knew was that Mr. Manny was keeping a big secret. He was, in fact, a billionaire, the richest man in the village. He often kept a small key tied around his neck, hidden beneath his tattered shirt, which opened a box that contained documents to his vast fortune. But he kept it from everyone because there was more to his wealth that not even his wives nor his daughters knew. You see, Mr. Manny's story is just getting started, and soon you'll realize why you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, because a poor man today might be your helper tomorrow. Now, when Mr. Manny reached his 55th year, trouble knocked on his door, and he fell really, really ill. One day, he woke up, and his hands felt as heavy as stones, his legs as stiff as dry branches. He tried to lift them, but they wouldn't budge. It was as if his own body had turned against him. Mr. Manny's family, seeing their father struggle, hurried to find healers. They went from one healer to another, carrying him on their backs like a sack of millet, hoping for a cure. The healers rubbed herbs on his skin, whispered chants, and gave him bitter roots to chew, but nothing worked, not even a drop of improvement. Mr. Manny's sickness only grew, spreading over him like dark clouds before a storm. As the days turned to weeks, his family grew weary. They spent all the money they had, but Mr. Manny lay there, weaker than before. His hands wouldn't move. His legs lay still. The sickness had taken him, like a fish caught in a net, and his family's patience thinned like the last drops of water in a dry season. As Mr. Manny lay helpless, his family slowly turned their backs on him, one by one, like leaves falling from a tree in Harmattan. His wives looked at him with eyes full of regret, whispering to each other, "What a mistake we made marrying this useless man. We deserve better." Even his daughters, who were as beautiful as the stars in a clear night sky, had no respect for their father. They were the pride of the village, with their beauty catching the eyes of every rich man around. But when Mr. Manny tried to speak, to tell them right from wrong, they would roll their eyes and laugh. "Why should we listen to you?" they sneered. "What do you know? You're nothing but an illiterate old man. Go to school first before you tell us what to do." Their words stung Mr. Manny's heart like thorns, but he could do nothing. He lay there, watching his own family drift further away, treating him as if he were a burden, a shadow they wished would disappear. And so Mr. Manny lay silent, his heart as heavy as a rock, left alone by the very family he had cared for all his life. He would often stare at the old photographs on the wall pictures of his daughters when they were little, with toothy grins and eyes full of innocence. It was hard to believe those same children had now turned away from him. Mr. Manny's sickness turned from bad to worse, swallowing him up like a dark storm. He lay there, unable to control his own body, wetting himself, soiling his clothes. But his daughters only laughed at him, mocking him in his misery. They didn't lift a finger to help. They didn't cook for him, didn't clean his clothes. They left him lying there, his clothes smelling foul, as if he were nothing more than a forgotten rag. It was only the kind neighbors who took pity on him. Every day, they would bring a small bowl of food, just once, and set it by his side. They didn't stay long. They had their own lives to tend to, but at least they showed kindness, a warmth that Mr. Manny's own family refused to give. And as if that wasn't enough, his daughters brought strange men home, filling the house with noise and laughter. Paying no mind to their sick father lying nearby. They did whatever they wanted, dancing, drinking, laughing loudly in front of him as though he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. And all Mr. Manny could do was lie there, trapped, watching his own family shatter his heart into 1,000 pieces. One bright afternoon, Mr. Manny's eldest daughter, proud and beautiful, walked into the house with a tall, rich man by her side. His name was Victor. He was handsome, with eyes as sharp as an eagle's, and dressed in clothes finer than any the villagers had seen. She held her head high, thinking she had brought home the perfect man. But as soon as Victor stepped into the room and saw Mr. Manny lying there, weak and frail, he froze. His eyes widened, and without a second thought, he dropped to his knees and prostrated, bowing so low his forehead touched the ground. "Ah, Baba!" he greeted with deep respect. "It is an honor to be in your presence." Mr. Manny's daughters gasped, their mouths open wide with shock. They had never seen anyone show their father such respect, especially not a rich man like Victor. In their minds, their father was nothing but a useless, sick old man, yet here was Victor, bowing to him as if he were a king. The daughters stood speechless, their hearts pounding with confusion and wonder. As Victor rose from the floor, he looked around and noticed the stunned faces of Mr. Manny's daughters. Their eyes were wide and their mouths hung open like fish out of water, unable to understand why this wealthy, respected man was bowing to their father. Victor turned to them and said, "Do you not know your father? Baba Manny is my boss. He owns the largest gold mine in this village." The words fell like thunder in the room. The daughters' eyes grew even wider, and their hearts beat like drums. They looked at each other, trying to grasp what Victor was saying. "Our father." One of them stammered, disbelief thick in her voice. "But he's just a poor sick man. How could he?" Victor shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "Your father may look simple, but he is wiser than any of us know. Years ago, he took a 5-year leave from the mine, putting me in charge as the manager. He trusted me to handle the business and be the face of the mine while he stayed here, unseen and unheard." Mr. Manny's daughters were left speechless, their minds spinning with the revelation. The man they had mocked, ignored, and laughed at was, in truth, the richest man in the village. Their father was not the fool they had thought him to be. Victor sat down, his voice calm and steady, as he began to tell the daughters a story they had never heard. "You see," Victor began, "the men in this village may be educated, but their wealth comes from something much deeper, something buried beneath the soil." He paused, letting the words settle. "Gold." The daughters listened, their eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. "This village," Victor continued, "sits on a treasure trove of gold. Many men became wealthy because of it, but few know that the largest gold mine, the richest land, belongs to none other than your father, Baba Manny." The daughters gasped, looking at each other with disbelief. How could this be? Their father, the man they thought was the poorest, the man they looked down on, was the owner of the biggest treasure in the land. Victor nodded, seeing their shock. "Your father kept it a secret," he explained. "He only had daughters, and he knew that wealth can bring danger. People would try to use his riches, try to sway his daughters for their own gain, so he chose to live quietly, hiding his fortune to protect you all." The daughters' faces grew pale. They had treated their father with scorn and disrespect, not knowing the sacrifices he had made, the secrets he had kept to keep them safe. Victor looked at the daughters, his eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. Your father, he began, his voice heavy, had a plan, one he kept to himself. He wanted to know who would stay by his side when he had nothing, who would care for him if times grew hard. So he decided to pretend he was sick. The daughters listened, shame creeping into their hearts like shadows. They looked down, remembering how they had treated their father, the man who had raised them, as if he were nothing. Your father thought, Victor continued, that perhaps in his weakest moment, his family would gather around him, support him, and show him love. But one by one, everyone he cared for turned away. The room was silent, the air thick with regret. Victor's voice softened as he spoke. Not even his wife stayed. They left him. And you, his daughters, you laughed at him, mocked him while he lay there, hoping for a single hand to hold him, a single heart to care. The daughters felt their faces grow hot with shame, each memory of their cruel words coming back like arrows. They had laughed at their own father, thinking him worthless, never once guessing that he was testing them, that he was watching to see who would stand by him. But in his lowest moment, they had all failed him. News of Mr. Manny's true wealth spread through the village like wildfire. The people who had once laughed at him, who had called him a fool and looked down on him, now stood frozen in shock. Their whispers filled the air like the rustling of dry leaves, voices filled with disbelief and regret. How could we have been so blind? The villagers murmured, Mr. Manny, the richest man among us, living like the poorest. Mr. Manny's daughters felt their hearts sink like stones in deep water. Every laugh, every harsh word they had thrown at him came rushing back to their minds. They remembered the times they had turned away, mocked him, left him lying helpless and alone. His wives, too, felt the sharp sting of regret. They had walked away, thinking they deserved more, thinking Mr. Manny had nothing to offer. But now they saw the truth. They had lost everything. The life they could have lived, the comfort and joy they could have had all slipped away because they had turned their backs on the one who loved them most. The entire village felt the weight of their shame, but none felt it as heavily as Mr. Manny's own family. They had not just lost wealth. They had lost the trust, the warmth, and the love of a father who had been willing to give them everything. Mr. Manny, seeing the sorrow and regret in the faces of his daughters and wives, sat quietly, his heart heavy but clear. He had seen who truly cared for him in his darkest days, and he knew what he wanted to do with his wealth. Instead of giving his riches to the family that had abandoned him, Mr. Manny chose to honor those who had shown him kindness, those who had brought him food when he was sick, those who had offered a hand when he was alone. One by one, Mr. Manny called upon the villagers who had helped him. To the neighbors who brought him food each day, he gave sacks of rice, bags of yams, and coins that sparkled like the morning sun. To the children who would visit and sing for him, he gave clothes and toys, and even a little gold. For every act of kindness, he returned it with gifts, blessing those who had blessed him. The village was filled with joy and gratitude, their hearts warm with the kindness of this man they had once overlooked. And so Mr. Manny's wealth spread across the village like rain, nourishing a dry land, filling the hearts of those who had cared for him in his hardest time, filling the hearts of those who had cared for him in his hardest time. In his final gathering with the villagers, Mr. Manny stood before them, his voice quiet but full of wisdom. He looked out at the faces around him, the faces of those who had helped him and those who had helped him. and those who had turned away. With a calm heart, he revealed the truth. "Dear friends," he began, "though I pretended to be sick at first, fate has now made it real. I have only 6 months left." A hush fell over the crowd, and his daughters began to weep, their faces wet with tears of regret. They knelt before him, begging, "Father, please forgive us. We were blind. We didn't see your kindness, your strength. Please forgive us." But Mr. Manny only smiled a gentle, weary smile. "My daughters," he said softly, "you have shown me your hearts. I have seen who you truly are. My love for you remains, but trust must be earned, and respect must be earned, and respect must be given freely." With those words, Mr. Manny turned to those who had cared for him, who had stood by him without knowing his wealth. And so, in the company of those who had shown him true kindness, Mr. Manny spent his last days in peace. When he passed, the village remembered him not as a poor, uneducated man, but as a wise, generous soul who taught them that kindness and respect are worth more than gold. His story remained in their hearts like a guiding star, reminding them always to honor those who stand by them in times of need. Thank you for joining us today for the story of Mr. Manny, a tale that reminds us of the true value of kindness and respect. Wealth is not always measured by money, but by the love and care we give and receive. Let us take Mr. Manny's story as a lesson to cherish those who stand by us, especially in our hardest moments. Remember, true riches come from the heart. Stay tuned for more stories that will inspire and touch your soul.